Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the differences between heeled shoes versus flats. I usually always recommend people to start off with flats first because you can't go wrong with flats. But if you aren't the type of person that's going to benefit from the heeled shoes, not only are you going to waste a lot of money on more expensive shoes, but they're not going to help you. So stick with flats until you kind of understand what you want to do with it. But here, we're just going to go over the heeled shoes first. Now, notice I'm going to try a couple of different stances just so you guys kind of have an idea of what you should kind of and kind of not be doing. So the first one was heels squats close, and then the second round was heeled squats going wide. Now, I want you to take a look at the differences between squatting wide and squatting close with the heels, right? Now, you could literally video yourself and kind of do this yourself and just kind of look. If you were to look at me on the left and me on the right, which one of these would you rather want to look like? Now, just from my personal preference, if I was to look at someone's technique, I would say the one on the right looks way more comfortable, way more relaxed. My chest is way up. I look way more comfortable on the right versus the left. And if you look at the green lines kind of going up and down, you can almost see the amount of pressure where the edge of the weight is kind of hovering on. On the left side, you're going to notice a lot of pressure is going to be on where your hip joint is at, a lot of pressure is on your knee. On the right side, everything's kind of more stacked on top of each other. So if you notice you've been having like knee issues or hip pains from lifting or squatting and stuff like that, you might not want to go with a wide heeled stance. Now also, if you've been having some issues with your squat where you're leaning forward, this is kind of what's going on, okay? So imagine if you're already leaning forward. Just imagine how awkward this technique or this is gonna look like when you have heels, right? The issue with leaning forward and then adding heels is just going to make you lean forward even more. So if you are already having some forward lean problems with your squat, maybe adding heels might not be super ideal. But then again, everybody's a little different. So definitely mess around with technique and stuff like that. Find out where you feel the strongest, and really take a look at your technique overall. But if you look here, if you're already leaning forward and you have the heels, look what's going on. Like pretty much my butt, the blue arrow where my butt is coming up is kind of driving the weight up. It's going to force me to kind of fall forward. And this is where all the pressure is at right now, right? Where that green line is at. So if you look, there's a lot of pressure on my ankle joints, and my knee joints are having to balance or kind of hover a little bit more than I need to. And what's going to happen is I'm going to continue leaning forward until I find the balance that I need in order to drive the weight up. And this is where a lot of people are going to good morning. So if you find yourself good morning your squats, perhaps adding heels may not be the most beneficial, because if you really think about it, if you need to be um, keeping your chest up, getting rid of the heel just means your foot's gonna naturally sit down lower, right? You're just gonna naturally shift back, and it's gonna look a little different than it is with the heels. Now, depending on what you plan on using your squats for, you could technically kind of do whatever you want as long as you don't get hurt. Now, this is just me squatting 315, one going wide, which is the video shown on the right, and one going close, which is the video on the left. Over the years, I've noticed that if you have a close stance, kind of high barish, or if you're quad dominant, the heels tend to favor those. So like a lot of Olympic weightlifters or a lot of bodybuilders who's trying to build the size of the quads, this would be very good for you. I've noticed that going wider with the heels is a very bad idea because of all the pressure that it puts on your hips. So I wouldn't normally recommend people to squat with a wide stance using heels where you're going to be leaning forward a little bit more, kind of rocking back and forth. But here's the thing. if you kind of know what you're doing and you want to build a strength in your hips, and you know that you don't plan on going super heavy and you're using it for a very specific reason, I don't see why not. You should use the heels for a wide stance squat, but just understand that there's a lot more room for injury if you're doing a wide stance with heels, even if that is your strongest position, you know, if you're going to use it for maxing out or for powerlifting. So just be aware that every stance, especially like with the heels, has its positive and its negatives. Just be aware of when to utilize these shoes. Okay, so next up, we're going to go over flats. I usually recommend flats more because they're cheaper. They feel more comfortable, and you can kind of utilize them for all lifts versus just the heels. I think the heels are only good for like squats, and that's technically it, or what you would kind of want to use them for. But anyways, we're going to go over the differences between a narrow stance flat squat and a wide stance wrestling or flat squat, just so you can kind of see the differences and why people with flat feet or people with high arches might decide to use different shoes. So I have very, very flat feet, so the flat shoes kind of benefit me more, even if I was going to go close or wide. So if you notice in the left, with a fairly close stance, everything is still kind of stacked on top of each other. If you notice though, where the ankle is at, where my feet and my shin kind of meet, that part right there looks very uncomfortable, almost like if I'm over bending it or I'm overreaching my flexibility there. Now the reason why it's okay for me to be in this position is because I do a lot of stretching and I'm fairly mobile, so I'm not going to have the same issues squatting this narrow with flats versus someone else who may not have the ankle mobility or calf mobility that I have. On the other spectrum, if you look over to the right, even though I'm a little bit wider than normal, you can almost see the line that my feet makes with my knee and my hip. It looks fairly awkward, but it's not as bad as it looked like versus the heeled when I was going this wide. If you notice, to a degree, my chest is even more upright in the wide stance than I am in the narrow stance. So in all honesty, if you are a wider stance squatter, like the way I'm setting up on the right picture, squatting with flats might actually benefit you a little bit more in this aspect, because in general, if you have good hip mobility, then you won't really have too much issue squatting like the way you are on the right. So there is pros and cons to utilizing flats when you squat versus the heels, but in general, if you think about the flats, they're generally much better overall. You can kind of get away with one or the other a little bit more in terms of if you want to go close or if you want to go wide. It's just a matter of, do you have enough flexibility in your ankles if you're going close, or do you have enough flexibility in your hips if you're going wide, and how much maintenance do you have to do with stretching and mobility in order to achieve your strongest position in the squat. Or if you're just building muscle, then you kind of want to just think about what muscles are being activated the most when you choose your stance or when you choose your shoes. Okay, so now this goes back to the question of when you lean forward. Now, a lot of people, when they lean forward, a lot of people always think like they should put on a pair of heels, right? But why don't we look at myself when I lean forward now with the flats versus the heels from earlier. Now, if you look at my feet, because they're more flat and the shoes that I'm wearing is flat, it's not heeled where I'm leaning forward. My hip is almost rotated back a little bit more. So even when I'm struggling in this position where I'm leaning forward, which is a handicap to a degree in my technique, just wearing the flats make it a little bit easier on my body. If you look at my feet, it doesn't look as awkward. Now you can imagine before the lines were kind of in a decline where it's kind of going downwards, right? Now in this position, you know, my feet and my ankles are more kind of in a triangle type shape, which kind of builds a little bit more stability for people with flat feet, right? On another spectrum, if you're leaning forward, you're always going to be putting pressure on your knee. So if you wear heels, you're going to put even more pressure on your knee. So if you can maintain good technique with flats and you're able to sit back more, because without the heel, you would sit back more, not lean forward, it will relieve tension in your knees, relieve tension in your hips with flats if you are flat footed in general. But for the most part, we're going to kind of go over the differences between like a wide stance and a closed stance with flats. And this is again 315 pounds, very similar to the heels. Now, because my technique looks fairly good with wide or closed stance with the flats, I could technically choose between the closed stance and wide stance flats, or the closed stance heel shoes, right? I don't want to go the wide stance heel shoes because there's too much pressure on my ankles, on my knees, and on my hips, and there's too many reasons for injury. So the best bet would be a mixture between the two flats and the narrow stance heel. Now the question that you have to ask is, what am I trying to do with my squats? Am I trying to lift very, very heavy weights, or am I trying to build a certain amount of muscle on my legs, either in the quads or in the hamstrings or glutes? For my particular case, I'm trying to be as strong as possible. So because I'm flat footed, it would be ideal for me to be in flats. Now, I'm much stronger in a medium to wide stance. So my stance of choice would kind of be the wider stance with flats, but probably not that wide if I'm raw, right? However, if I was trying to build more quad muscles, I would probably choose the heeled narrow stance, where there's a lot more pressure on my quads, on the muscles, less tension on my calves. I'm not going to be going as heavy as a power lifter or if I was training for strength, but I'm still going to be lifting as heavy as I can to build those muscles, right? And then on the other spectrum, I could utilize the flats with a closed stance squat for utilizing more of my hamstrings and my glutes, versus the heeled where I would be more lean forward and I'll be utilizing more of my quads. So if I wanted to build more glutes and hamstrings as a bodybuilder or to build muscle, I would probably choose the flat shoes with a more narrower stance so I can sit back more, utilizing the posterior chain, which involves the hamstrings and the glutes. So it really just depends on what you're trying to do with your training, and whatever those goals are can kind of dictate which shoes or what kind of style you want to pick in terms of what shoes you want to wear and in terms of what stance you want to pick.